I'm Rod Downing from Vancouver, Canada, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this climate series. Thank you for taking the time from your schedule for this important session. Today's topic is biodiversity loss, the fraying tapestry of life. Dr. Phoebe Barnard will lead this session and will be introduced shortly. For those who are joining for the first time, we start with the simple overall goal of this series: to move the needle from our current destructive patterns toward a sustainable flourishing of life for all. Within that, the basic gauge is quite simple: our global carbon emissions dropping. Now, today is the fourth session in this part of the series. The website contains all details of everything we've done, including archives of all previous sessions, if you want to, if you missed them or want to review them. Plus, it's got possible actions. And its link, that is the website link, is also in every email you receive, so you don't have to frantically jot it down. We started in November with Dr. Gammon, originally from the IPCC, who presented the basic science, and then returned in January to give us the implications and responses that we could do personally or on a larger scale. In February, we had a panel from our church leadership exploring how to engage as a faith community. That brings us to this month's topic on biodiversity. Before proceeding, please note two things. Firstly, today's session is followed by two identical discussion groups. Unfortunately, at some earlier point, the dates were incorrectly stated. The correct dates are in the email you received, and specifically next Sunday, March 14th and Thursday, March 18th. Now, you'll all be getting emails for those, but if you write them down in a calendar, you might want to make sure you got them right. That's the 14th and 18th. Our apologies for the error. Secondly, we are grateful for the Greater Pacific Northwest Mission Center for sponsoring this series. So let's get started with a brief reflection to keep this series fully dimensional. Lori?
Thanks, Rod. So I wanted to just remind us that the intention for this series is, yes, first to learn about and deepen our understanding of the climate crisis with all of the complex issues that are entailed. We've gotten quite a bit of that. But it's also true that we need courage to be able to face the challenges and to find in our hearts changes in our lifestyles in response. So our invitation is also and always to expand the capacity of our hearts so that we can hold as one our love for the world and its beauty, as well as the suffering of the earth and all creatures who share this planet with us. To that end, I have a reading from Wendy Farley's book, Beguiled by Beauty, to get us started and remember that head and heart. She says, how difficult it is to maintain an open heart in these dark days. Climate change performs its destructive work even more quickly than we'd feared. Hatred is being given permission to rage with impunity. Work, school, and religion are often alienating. Technology silently steals our ability to concentrate or think deeply. And our activism can sometimes make us sympathize with Sisyphus condemned to endlessly pushing a stone up a mountain only to have it roll back as it nears the summit. Even our religious commitments sometimes feel dry and as dust, but the world remains so tender and lovely, so vulnerable and enigmatic. How can we keep opening our hearts to the sorrow and tragedy of the world and at the same time remain alert to its endlessly proliferating splendors? How can we train ourselves to fall ever more deeply in love with the world without glossing over what needs to be done and the deception and cruelty? She goes on later, and for today, I think this is a wonderful invitation for us today. As creatures of spirit, our longing for the sacred is not about a private relationship with the holy who's other. Our longing for the sacred is a call to honor the sacred worth of every creature. And it is with that recognition that I would just offer as a blessing for our gathering. May we hear with our minds and in our hearts today this sacred call to honor the worth of every creature that shares this planet with us. Susie's going to introduce Phoebe now. So.
In November, Dean and I had the opportunity to hear Phoebe speak in front of City Hall in Mount Vernon, Washington, at a small climate strike rally. Following the rally, we sat with her for coffee to discuss our climate colloquy objectives, to hear her talk a little bit about her expertise and her experiences and possible interest in presenting for us. You can read Phoebe's education and biography in detail on her website, phoebebarnard.com, which I would encourage you to do because it details her education, her work, her awards, and her recognitions. But what struck me when I read it, and then as we spoke at the coffee shop, is really how very relevant her life is and has been, how passionate she is, and how much she will benefit us in our work for climate justice. Just going to point out some highlights. Phoebe writes, I am lucky enough to work on some of the most compelling, urgent, existential issues of our time. As a sustainability strategist, climate change scientist, conservation biologist, planner, policy translator, and media communication strategist. My passions involve helping the world learn from its mistakes to become smarter, fairer, cleaner, taking steps towards a new world order where people and the planet actually matter. I've worked globally, nationally, bioregionally, and locally, usually with one foot in government and the other in academia on climate change, biodiversity, and society. This includes the science of wildfires and their impacts, wildlands and urban landscapes, human ecology, and behavior change. I am a senior scientist and policy strategist at the Conservation Biology Institute, an affiliate full professor of environmental futures and conservation science at the University of Washington. Before that, I ran the Pacific Biodiversity Institute and worked with the Center for Large Landscape Conservation to develop a global specialist group on intact wild landscapes. I am also a research associate at the University of Cape Town's Fitzpatrick Institute of African Ornithology and African Climate Development Initiative. I've been privileged to work in South Africa for 34 years through 2017. I was lead scientist for climate change adaptation and biodiversity futures at the South African National Biodiversity Institute and led 2 international research teams, one on future scenarios for biodiversity under land use and policy change in Africa, and one on the vulnerability of endemic birds to climate and land use change along Africa's southwest coast. Before that, I founded Namibia's,
Namibia.
I'm saying
Namibia, Susie.
Namibia, sorry, thank you, Phoebe. First national programs on biodiversity and climate change. Impatient with the limitations of science, I'm trying to hasten sustainability tipping points in the natural world, in human economies and behavior, in societies and politics. By night, I'm a loving wife, parent, neighbor, community volunteer, trainee filmmaker, and haphazard cook. During Phoebe's presentation, put your comments in the chat box. Susan or Joan will read them. For questions for later, send them in the chat to Lori Gordon. If you can't use the chat box, just wave your hand and Rod will find you and call on you. I am so excited, Phoebe, to have you share your passion and your heart with us now.
Thank you so much, Susie. And I am really delighted to meet you all. It's a real privilege to join you. And I don't have a headset and microphone, so give me an audio check. Am I sounding clear enough? Okay. I was horrified at how long that sounded. I'm so sorry. I should have summarized it into one sentence, which is all really most people want to hear. But yeah, just to clarify, I've been living 38 years outside the USA, 34 of those in Namibia and South Africa, with 13 of those years in South Africa most recently. And it's something that I will try to weave into the story today. So thank you all for joining. When I started talking with Susie, Dean, Susan, and Rod, and everybody, Laurie, this afternoon, just before this talk, it was glorious sunshine. And I said, how horrible to have to bring you all inside to listen to me. Now it's about to pour in Mount Vernon, Washington, where I am. So I don't feel quite so bad, but it's probably still glorious where most of you are. So if you'll indulge me, I'd like to share some slides, which I'd like to make much more of a fireside chat and much less of a scientific talk. I'm actually pretty right-brained for a scientist. It's amazing that I ever managed to have a successful scientific career, because I can get quite impatient with small details. I think Laurie will have been much more effective as a core scientist than I, although she clearly also has that heart-centered drivenness that I think is important these days. But I will try to weave a little bit of my life through the slides that I'd like to share now. So if you'll give me a second, I'm going to share my screen and open up the talk. Okay. I'm married to an English filmmaker, and anyone who's ever lived in Britain for a while may know of a show, I think it was called Blue Peter, where the narrator, I never saw it, I only heard about it from British people. The narrator starts out, "Are we sitting comfortably? Then we'll begin." It was a children's show. So hope that you're all sitting comfortably. It seems to me that the love and awe that we all feel for nature, I think it's fair to say that most of us will feel that awe and love for nature, is what must drive us in these really pivotal times. I loved what you read, Laurie, from the book by Wendy Farley. And I scribbled to write it down. So I just want to remind you all of it. The world remains so tender and lovely, so vulnerable and enigmatic. And I'm often saying to people on social media or to my students or my postdocs, let us not take this exquisitely evolved, beautiful, enchanting planet and mess it up. So this will indeed be about biodiversity loss, but it's also about biodiversity love and biodiversity healing. I grew up with a father who was a member of the Unitarian Universalist Church and a mother who sometimes taught Sunday school in the Congregational Church in my little hometown in New England. But I always felt that forests were my cathedral, and mountains, and particularly volcanoes. I have an unusual predilection maybe for climbing erupting volcanoes, and the more active, the better. But when I am in a misty forest like this one, I feel closest to some higher presence than ever before. And so I'd like to just spend a minute or two reminding us of the things that we probably find enchanting and lovely and exquisite about our planet. And I will return to most of these species later in the talk. But all of us who feel relaxed and calm and inspired and energized when we are out in nature know too well that much of our world is not this healing anymore. Rod, you live probably closer than many of us to the Alberta tar sands. It's been extraordinary to me as a global change scientist watching the accelerating speed of human destruction of this planet, how much we have lost in the last 50 years. And how ruthlessly we seem able and willing to completely destroy ecosystems for private profit. And so from a very early age, my life became clear to me was going to have to be about that and fighting it, but also continuing to love it. It seems bizarre to me and probably to many of you that we are all investing both private and public money in activities that, apart from the scientific curiosity about our neighboring planets, seem focused on establishing human colonies on Mars. I've even met a woman in South Africa who was planning to be one of the first Mars colonists and had been accepted into such a program. I love NASA, I love science, I love astronomy, but this leaves me cold. How can we take this exquisite planet of ours and just write it off and try to go on to live on something that is as bleak and inhospitable as Mars? So my talk today is really about this tapestry of life, how it is unraveling, but also how we must take a decision now globally as a global community of people of faith, of scientists, of teachers, of artists, of students, of activists, of business people, of politicians. Take a decision to repair and restore this planet, and therefore draw down the carbon by protecting the biodiversity that we have, which is quietly doing all of that carbon capture free for us while we speak. So my name is Phoebe. I am with the Conservation Biology Institute and the University of Washington. And as you heard, I still have an association or two with the University of Cape Town back in South Africa. Now, why a tapestry? Well, it's probably clear enough, but I think all of the things that we find beauty in, like a prayer, a poem, a book, a painting, share with nature the richness and strength that comes from the interconnectedness of its strands, its threads. And all of our dominant world religions, it seems to me, embrace the kind of beauty that comes from that intricate balance of complexity and pattern and process that put together forms this awe-inspiring whole. And in all of the world's religions, a kind of symmetry and balance brings an inordinate beauty that I think all of us can appreciate. I was a calligrapher when I was a teenager, not a particularly good one, but good enough to be asked to do my high school graduation invitations and my and other people's wedding invitations. So I appreciate the way in which calligraphy of different kinds achieves pattern and beauty in its symmetry. And of course, like a paragraph, when the threads fall apart, the individual letters make little or no sense. And of course, we know that many of the world's religions incorporate natural motifs into their symbolism because nature is so fundamental to our evolution, our behavior, our upbringing, the patterns of things that we learn to love and respect. Sometimes we respect them. Sometimes we seem to have been not taught to respect them. So for those of us who have forests as cathedrals, and this picture was taken by my daughter, an incipient filmmaker and photographer, just turning 25 and also just going to college and to university. It's important that we understand not only how we feel in forests, but also the vast central importance of forests to helping us avert a climate emergency, to draw down carbon, to keep functioning soils, and all of the important global services that forests provide. Now, these two happy young lovers are, I'm sure you can guess, my own parents. My dad had gone off to World War II, just having proposed to my mom, who was the ripe old age of 18. And I felt so lucky to be born to them very late in their lives, really. I'm still in my 50s, and both of my parents have passed away. My dad this year would be 103. But from him, I gained a kind of quiet calmness and a curiosity about the world that was incredibly abiding. And my dad had always wanted to be a geologist and an ornithologist, but being saddled with the responsibility of taking over the family slate roofing company that had been started in 1855, he did a geology degree and then tried to subvert his scientific energies into his children. So he was thrilled when I went off to university and studied geology and ornithology. And from my mother, I inherited an exuberant cheerfulness, which is very useful in times of a climate crisis and a biodiversity crisis, if you are working on biodiversity vulnerability to climate change. So although we did not have lots of money, I felt incredibly privileged from the love that they had for each other until the day my dad died, and my mum still carried on loving him for another 18 years until she died a year ago. And I think many of us will have been lucky. I know it's not universal, but many of us will have been lucky enough to have been introduced to nature and love and peace and respect, curiosity, tolerance, integrity, and other really crucial human values by their parents. Fast forward to, let's see, when was it? 1994, when I was off studying in Sweden. And my parents, now gray-haired, the two on the left, joined with my brother on the right and my father's eldest sister next to me there in the middle, my graduation ceremony in Sweden for my PhD. And it was my dad's greatest gift to hand over to me some binoculars, which I still have, Zeiss 10 by 40s, which were very important to me in my work and still are. But fundamentally, the thing that they gave me most was starting to walk in the woods as a family from the time I could barely walk. I think I learned to walk on trails like this. And I hope each of us can think back to a moment in their childhood when they realized that whatever it was that they loved, a love for nature was among that. When we think about the fraying of the tapestry of nature, I often think about the dawn chorus. And this man here is called Rob Hopkins. Many of you may know the Transition Network globally, which works on community cohesion and resilience in times of shocks to the system, like peak oil or a global pandemic or wildfires or earthquakes or a terrorist strike. It could be anything, but our communities, dependent as they are in North America, especially on private cars and the loss of knowledge of our neighbors that so easily goes along with that. Rob Hopkins founded the transition town of Totnes in the UK and has gone on to share the concept of community resilience in local villages and communities that help people reconnect to the earth, help people know their neighbors and share resources, help people get off the grid and become more self-sufficient, and help people remember what's important in life. So I thought it was appropriate, being a board member of my local transition group on Fidalgo Island in Washington, to refer you to Rob Hopkins' readings from his one of his latest books called From What If, What Is to What If, a book about imagination and imagining the futures that we can have once we decide what's broken in our society and to choose to leave it behind. But Rob Hopkins has a wonderful little session here about going out in the morning before dawn to sit quietly in a field and listen to the birds wake up around him. As an ornithologist, I did this all the time, but I'm sure not all of you are equally early morning people. Probably some of you are night owls. And I'd love to hear from those of you in the chat function for whom a dawn chorus is an important thing. But when I was living in Cape Town, South Africa, I became aware, no, earlier, sorry, when I was living in Windhoek, Namibia, and running a big national program for government, I was also trying to do some research for my PhD in a few years' time in Sweden, working on birds, and I had set up aviaries so that I could look at the behavior of birds in a controlled environment before letting them go. And I realized for the first time how critically dangerous were the hazards of urban life for birds. Cats were pouncing on birds and killing them. Cars were hitting birds. Birds were even flying into the few skyscrapers that existed in that small capital city of only 100,000 people. And I started to realize that the tapestry of life was fraying because vulnerable bird species that I knew and loved around my house while I was bringing up my children were starting to disappear. And then when I moved to South Africa, we had friends who moved from a distant neighborhood, quite a rural neighborhood of Cape Town, closer into the center of the city. And my ornithologist friend, Christian, he was a Spanish South African ornithologist, immediately noticed the depauperate dawn chorus. It suddenly went from being about 12 birds that he would hear as he woke up early in the morning to being 2. English sparrows, house sparrows, chip, 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 and starlings, Eurasian starlings. And both of those were invasive species in South Africa. All the indigenous birds had left the city. So I started to think about the dawn chorus as a metric, a proxy for the health of our biodiversity. And I want to just sort of listen to this for a few seconds. Breathe deeply. Anyone recognize any of these species? I should clarify that I cheated a little bit because although Rob Hopkins was an English guy, I took a recording of American birds. So hopefully you'll recognize a few of them. Urban life has many threats for birds, and building collisions are a big factor. I became aware visiting Seattle when I got here and wandering around early in the morning looking for the place of my early morning meetings. I met a bunch of doormen in office blocks and sidewalk sweepers. And so I started to chat to them about whether they encountered dead or dying birds in the morning. And 3 out of the 10 said yes, they were quite worried about it. And one old man in his late 80s, who was still working as a sidewalk sweeper, said it broke his heart to see the birds that were dead or dying in the morning. So we're probably going to start a little project on this, but you probably will have heard that 1 billion birds a year just in North America alone are believed to die from building strikes. And then hundreds of millions, if not more, killed by cats. And a number of others killed through the loss of migratory stopover points as they migrate from A to B in their annual cycle. It's at times like this that I feel that it's hard to be working in my career, and especially not just in conservation, but those of us who work on the interface between climate change and conservation. There are times it would be hard to deny that despair can overcome me. But luckily, because of my mother, I'm somehow able to process that ecological grief pretty quickly and get back my inveterately cheerful DNA. My dad, after World War II, had briefly done some work, because he was an engineer, for the US Army Corps of Engineers. And even back in those times, he told me he was very disturbed by what was being planned for the Everglades. Basically taking a beautifully functioning, fragile ecosystem and trying to engineer it out of its flood regime, which often only made it worse. And I wish that my dad was alive today to see some of the changes that the US Army Corps of Engineers is finally making in order to listen to nature more. But my dad had told me a couple of years before he died that he had been very frustrated and realized that he was talking to brick walls among his superiors at the time. What I'm not sad about with my parents having left us is that they haven't seen the last 4 years, and they didn't see the last year, where we not only have all of the other things I've mentioned about biodiversity loss and the what I call triple whammy events, the big, hard, dangerous, complex disasters that can strike all at once, like catastrophic wildfires, a global pandemic, and biodiversity loss from agriculture and climate change. I was once in France, and I met one of the key guys working on the unraveling of the Tapestry. He's a chap called Stuart Pym from Duke University, and he's a fairly arrogant man. So he's the sort of person, I love him. I would regard him as my friend, but he is quite full of himself. And so he's the kind of guy who has memes about himself on the internet. But Stuart has written a number of books on extinction, as well as scientific papers like the one below. It's really important for us to reflect on this. And I think most of us here today know that we can't bring species back, but it's incumbent upon us to help share that information with people that never think about other species, don't see birds when they fly past. They don't notice. Species extinction is forever. And so part of my career has been on helping prevent extinctions. And I'll tell you a little bit more about those now. Some of you will know the acronym IUCN. It's the World Conservation Union, and it used to stand for the International Union for Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources, based in Geneva. And the IUCN is responsible for putting together the red lists, i.e. the lists of species that are endangered and threatened with extinction. We know from the work of the IUCN and conservation organizations, including my own all around the world, and from the work of the equivalent for biodiversity to the IPCC, you know, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which I have done some work with from my friend Richard Gammon. But the biodiversity world now has an equivalent body, the Intergovernmental Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which is a horrendous name, shortened rather awkwardly to IPBES, IPBES panel, Biodiversity Ecosystem Services. And we're very aware that the rate of extinction in most of these taxa, most of these species groups are going up at a rapid rate, particularly for amphibians, cycads, the tree fern-like species at the bottom, which are very common in the Southern Hemisphere, especially South Africa, as well as mammals, birds, reptiles, most vertebrates. We need to be very aware of this. It's really important not to be fatalistic about it. And I want to return to that theme. Excuse me. Almost 20 years ago, I was sitting at a conference of the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity in Nairobi, Kenya. I was at the time the lead negotiator for the government of Namibia at the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. And two American guys walked over and said, "Hey, we'd like to talk with you. We would like to have you join the board of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment." Now, at the time, I had heard a little bit about it, and it sounded like a big, overly funded UN thing, and I wasn't sure that I wanted anything to do with it. But fortunately, I think they talked me into it. So I became part of the leadership team of this big, very influential global assessment of ecosystems around the world and their ability to support human endeavor, including human health, human economic activity, and human well-being. And part of my scientific brain said, but why do we always have to focus on humans? The other part of my strategic brain said, no, this is the right thing, because nobody in power, nobody in the economy, no stockbrokers are ever thinking, forgive me if some of you are stockbrokers and are proving me wrong, or we're stockbrokers, but people don't think about other species. They're not interested in the natural world for its intrinsic value, but they will pay attention if we're talking about how the state of the planet affects the economy. So I got involved. And I want to show you this graph, which was the summary 4 years later in 2005 of a lot of the work of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. Now, on the left-hand side of your screen here are the major biomes or ecosystem categories of the world. And along the top are the column headings of all the big environmental drivers. In other words, the trends that are driving biodiversity loss and climate change and other problems. And this is quite a daunting graph because virtually all the arrows are going up, meaning things are getting worse. The trends are getting more, they're accelerating. I want you to notice two things about this. One, climate change in that column second from the left, and nitrogen and phosphorus pollution, nutrient pollution, are going up at an astronomical rate. They are the serious problems of our time. The other categories, which have kind of angled arrows or flat arrows, are still problems, but at least they're more stable, more manageable. And this kind of information gave us the artillery that we really needed to be able to show the world what needed to be done. There's one arrow pointing down on this map, on this graph only. I don't know whether you've spotted it yet, but under temperate forests and habitat change, there's been slight improvement, so the arrow's going down, but everything else is alarming. So compared to what was happening in 1960, the year before I was born, things have become so much worse. And I took this very personally because I felt responsible being born in 1961 to have had my whole life during this period and not being able to have it turned around. But I realized that those of us in our age group, my age and older, are particularly responsible for a lot of the things that are happening in the world today, and therefore we have to take chief responsibility for solving them. Wildfire, however, is one of the climate change issues which is accelerating fastest. This is not from California. This was from my valley in Cape Town, South Africa, and this was my neighbor's house. Ecosystems around the world need fire, but what they don't need is too frequent fire, or fire that is affected in its intensity by invasive alien species, like in this case, woody invasive trees from Australia that were choking out ecosystems and were incredibly flammable. So fire is one of the big things for those of us who work in the interface between conservation biology and climate change. Now, getting to some of the things that I tried to do and am trying to do to fight back against all of these arrows and negative trends is developing ways that people can become involved in changing things. And I imagine in this group, there may be some people who are involved in citizen science. And I'm going to use the terms citizen science and community science interchangeably. I think there's become an awareness that the term citizen science, where volunteers from the public who do not necessarily have a formal scientific training, at least in this area, can become involved in contributing data on where species are, what they're doing, how common they are, and when they're breeding, things like that, into a pool of knowledge that is necessary, but too much for professional scientists to be able to contribute to themselves. And so we had produced over time this kind of early warning system for biodiversity in not only South Africa, but some of the countries around it too, Namibia, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Botswana, and so on. And this ended up being a really exciting and surprisingly successful system, whereby ordinary people contributing data from bird watching or from butterfly catching or from other things that they like to do in their spare time. If they were a scuba diver, they could contribute information on coral. I'm going to go back for a second. On coral bleaching, for example. So we had a whole bunch of volunteer programs that citizen scientists or community scientists could contribute to and build up a body of knowledge that could shape public policy, planning, management, and other research. Spot quiz. Does anyone recognize this bird? You will have some ideas that it's probably a South African bird, and you'd be right. Anyone recognize it? If you do, put it in the chat function.
Condor, secretary bird.
Secretary bird, you're right, Susan. So the secretary bird is an incredibly unusual and evolutionarily distinct, wonderful raptor. It's weird looking. It's got these incredibly long, wiry eyelashes. It's got these long, beautiful plumes at the back of its head. And it's got very long legs. You can't even see most of its legs. In the bottom picture, they're down into the grass, about this long, an equivalent amount to the black part of its leg. And they go and stomp around the savannah and kill snakes and then swallow them whole. They're really cool birds. And I always loved secretary birds because the Canadian wildlife painter Robert Bateman had painted them. And I once tried to further my painting career by trying to copy Robert Bateman's painting of secretary birds. But I became aware that secretary birds were not doing well in South Africa. And we had a bird atlas program as part of this early warning system. Here's a map of South Africa. And in the little lines inside the map of South Africa, where all those colors are, you'll see the countries of Lesotho and what used to be called Swaziland, which is now Eswatini, and then Namibia and Botswana and Zimbabwe to the north. But my point about this map is just to show you that everywhere there is a red square on the map is a grid cell of the country where secretary birds had become locally extinct over a 20-year period. And everywhere it's orange, they were declining in number. So they were becoming less and less common relative to other birds. Everywhere that they were blue, there was actually a new sighting where they hadn't been seen 20 years ago. But overall, the picture is a little bit concerning. And so this was giving us really important geospatially explicit data to help inform planning and policy and management in this country. The red data status for this species, NT, means near threatened. But by the time we had finished this work, it became clear that the secretary bird was threatened, possibly endangered. We have community science data projects here in North America. You will know of eBird, perhaps, and the Christmas bird count, the breeding bird survey, the monarch migration that is studied by many people around the continent. And these are all incredibly wonderful, powerful ways, not only to democratize our knowledge about what's happening to species in space and in time, but help to raise people's knowledge and awareness and expertise by the end of it so that they can become really active champions. If anyone here is part of a citizen science project, I would love to hear more about it in the chat, and we can discuss it at the end. But this past week, I met this lovely guy, Peter Soroye, at the University of Ottawa, who was doing, unbeknownst to me, and I was unbeknownst to him, he's basically developing almost the same thing here in North America that I had been doing in Southern Africa with a whole team of people. So, you know, youngsters are grabbing the gauntlet, and we need to make it easy and supportive for them to do so and to help them ourselves, because those of you who are retired know that when you're not retired, it's hard to find time to do anything else other than working and raising kids or studying or whatever it is you're doing. And most people that retire still don't have any time, but maybe a little bit more time. Migration, termite emergence, bird breeding, all of these are called phenology, the study of changes in the species life cycle due to climate change, due to urbanization. And in South Africa, because these are all Namibian and South African pictures, the run of the sardines, the migration of European swallows, the molt of Cape sugarbirds there on the lower left, and the migration within the country of these beautiful butterflies are all examples of really important areas where citizen scientists can help get involved in understanding how phenology of life cycles is changing. The emergence of termite alates on the upper left, the blooming of the beautiful famous flowers in Namakwa-land, a part of South Africa, which is very famous for its beautiful flowers. The blooming of flowers in the Fynbos biodiversity hotspot, where an incredible profusion of life exists. And as I mentioned, the study by amateur divers of the health and diversity of coral reefs. All of these were part of our early warning system for biodiversity in South Africa. And there were lots of wonderful outcomes, both in science, and I'm just going to flash up pictures of some of the papers that came out of this work. In other words, these citizen science data weren't just mushy. They were collected according to simple but scientifically rigorous protocols, and we could actually get peer-reviewed scientific publications about it. These kinds of reviews of what was going on in the Southern Hemisphere. I am not going to quiz you on the contents of these papers. They're really just to show you, yes, there was science. But many countries around the world have been far more advanced than the US or Canada on citizen science. The UK is one of those countries. Australia's Climate Watch is another one that I was particularly fond of, and tried to develop what we did in South Africa, patterned on there, so that anybody who wanted to lodge a sighting could do so, even if they weren't participating in a formal, more rigorous protocol that required a certain degree of information to be taken, like how much time you were watching for and that kind of thing. And I'll leave it at that for the moment. But there are so many good examples, and I hope that iNaturalist and other exciting programs are familiar to many of you. So linking the science, linking the public policy and the planning and the conservation assessment, like this red data book for birds, all very, very important in drawing, in helping people feel engaged in changing the world, but also in making the government's decisions and landowners' management regimes that much more rigorous and well-founded. So this graph just shows how different kinds of data there in the blue could all be gathered by volunteers. And the system was designed by the science and policy community in government and academia, and it was statistically rigorous, but the engine of it was citizen science or community science. And at the bottom, the outcomes were better for policy and our understanding of what the trends were. So I just wanted to mention that. I think it's an important way for people to feel empowered. And then finally, just to wrap up, I'd like to mention the work that we did in the last year or two, focused on the 6 things that we all need to be focusing on as a species. 5 colleagues and I, along with thousands of other scientists co-signatories, published this paper, The World Scientists' Warning of a Climate Emergency, at the end of 2019. Now there are 14,802 co-signatories, I think. And we did follow-ups the following year about forests in the same journal. And then in in January, we published an update in Scientific American about what the world had done in 2020. Now think of 2020, you know, a year that will go down in history infamously and famously. We might think that the climate had got a bit of a break in 2020. People weren't flying a lot and so on. And so we reviewed evidence from a variety of metrics about how the climate emergency was doing and how our progress towards averting that emergency was globally. And I'm afraid our conclusions were pretty grim, because despite the pandemic, we were nowhere near where we needed to be to avoid serious climate instability in the next 7, 8, 10 years. And I think we can all agree that we're already starting to see that climate instability. I became convinced over the last 20 years that I was going to step outside the boundaries of what is commonly regarded as acceptable for scientists, that we just stick to the facts, that we speak in the driest, dustiest language possible, and that we do not wave our hands about big issues. But of course, being a scientist, I'm also a mother, I'm a wife, I'm a lover, I'm a neighbor, I'm like all of us, I could not sit and know what I knew from the IPCC, from the IPBES, the biodiversity equivalent, the research that I did myself, and not speak up about this. So the 6 recommendations that we made clear in those papers that humanity has to act on are these 6. Energy, that we need to, of course, have a renewable energy transition, and we need additionally to significantly conserve energy. We still use it so wastefully. Food systems, I'll go counterclockwise. Food systems. We need to go back to regenerative agriculture. We need to restore carbon in our soils because it's been hugely depleted and wasted. And we could be heading to a dust bowl in the US because of the frighteningly bad way that we have managed agricultural land. Not everybody. All of us will know some wonderful regenerative farmers, but everybody needs to be doing that. And we need to shift away from meat in our diets to plant-based diets increasingly. Doesn't mean nobody can eat meat ever. It just means people shouldn't be able to eat it 3 times a day, unless maybe they're Inuit. Nature and land, that we need to not only conserve land, but restore land. And specifically, we need to make sure that we are keeping ecosystems intact. Now, what does that mean? It basically means we've got to slam the brakes on land transformation, land destruction. We've got to stop opening up new land for subdivisions. We've got to stop logging new areas. We've certainly got to stop taking old growth and medium growth forests down. Why? Because trees need to grow up to sequester carbon. And the biological, ecological communities in their roots, in their canopies, all around their bark, the forest ecosystems, there are massive things lost when we log those forests. Economic goals, that we need to move definitively away from a profit-driven system that prioritizes gross domestic product but pays little or no attention to human health and well-being, or planetary health and well-being. Population stabilization, that we need to invest significantly in public health and reproductive education programs for girls and women especially, but not exclusively, because everybody needs to realize that the mathematics of high consumption and population growth create a disaster no matter what else we do. And so it's got to be very fair, it's got to be just, and it's certainly got to be targeted not to the brown and black population that white populations often think are the problem, but that we've got to pull back on our own consumption and our own reproduction, knowing that we are at the brink of the abyss if we don't. And then finally, and almost most narrowly, atmospheric pollutants like soot and methane. We need to pay special attention to make sure that methane and soot and chlorofluorocarbons are not escaping into the atmosphere, because they are powerful greenhouse gases and pollutants. And with the warming of the earth, you will probably know that permafrost and methane eruption is a serious, serious risk that we don't yet have a handle on. So I'm just going to finalize this by mentioning my dear friend and co-author, Bill Mumma. Bill is an emeritus professor at Tufts University. He was co-author on the World Scientists' Warning of a Climate Emergency, but he has been working for decades in the public arena to talk to people on these issues. And if you remember nothing else from this talk, it's good to plant trees, yes, as long as they're not being planted in a place where they don't naturally occur, because why is that? Pop quiz number 2. If anyone knows why you shouldn't plant trees where they don't naturally occur, apart from the obvious thing that they'll probably die, what's another reason? Put it in the chat function if you remember. But letting trees grow and mature into complex, beautiful tapestries of forest life is so much better than just planting trees. And then finally, restoration of ecosystems. My colleague, John Liu, is a soil scientist, he's a filmmaker, and he has championed the establishment of ecosystem restoration camps around the world. If you don't know about this movement, I would urge you to look it up. And if you can go and help one of these camps, please do, or send your children or your niece and nephew. But if you can't, then do as I do, still among the lumpen proletariat and working 18 hours a day. I can't do that, so I give them $10 a month just to help their activities. Ecosystem restoration camps are a significant and powerful way to help change the dialogue on our planet about what we're doing, and take those horrible pictures of the Alberta tar sands and other destroyed ecosystems around the world and make that completely unacceptable in the future. Thank you.
So Phoebe, in response to your last question, we have several people who have indicated why it is that you don't plant trees in places where they are not native. Joan, do you want to work with me on this?
Sure, I'll start with invasive species.
They didn't co-evolve.
They take over natural ecosystems, and that contributes to ...
Invasive species choke out native species and wildlife.
Species invasion.
And injure and destroy native ecosystems.
That's one set of very good arguments, and absolutely right. I didn't even mention that for about 18 months, I was lucky to work with the Global Invasive Species Program. I was its science coordinator, but I learned so much during that job that I didn't know before. And the real impacts of invasive species were among those issues. The degree to which hydrological regimes were affected by invasive woody plants, for example. So yes, all of that is true. It actually wasn't what I was thinking of, though. Were there any other answers? I'm going to open up the chat now that I can see it.
There is one more. It says plants need to be planted in their natural habitat where they support other wildlife and other wildlife supports them. It is a synergistic effect. They need to be part of the system, not countering it.
Yep, and that is also absolutely true. Thank you for that. And thank you for all of those suggestions. Absolutely right. And our focus needs to be retaining intact ecosystems rather than continuing to unravel them. And where we can, actively restoring species that have been lost. But again, that wasn't the exact one that I was thinking of. The one that I was thinking of relates to the physics of climate change. Anyone remember this word starting with A? Albedo. A lot of people have spoken about planting trees in the Sahara Desert, planting trees in the tundra. That's not a good idea, not only because the soils don't allow it, but when in some places they may. But the albedo of the earth, in other words, the reflectivity of the earth with sun and heat will, the trees are darker than snow or desert, so they will absorb more heat. And we've been told by the climate physicists over and over again, do not plant trees where they don't occur because we can't afford that. So that was actually what I had in mind, but all of those answers are absolutely right. Thank you. I appreciate these comments. I'm just going through them now. Thank you so much for interacting. Hello, Andrew Fellows. I saw that you were here. And yes, you've mentioned the RSPB, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, and its annual birdwatch. I seem to remember that the RSPB, when I first got to England as the young wife of an English ornithologist, that the RSPB in those days even had 2 million members, which is pretty impressive for a small island of what was then only about 56 or 58 million people. And I also see that Andrew's mentioned having a whale track app to log cetacean sightings. That's very important. So I would love to encourage everyone here to, maybe what I'll do, if you'll forgive me, I didn't think ahead about this, but there are a number of organizations that can help you find a citizen science project in your area. And one of them doesn't pop up on my screen, but it's called the Citizen Science Alliance. And that enables you to join projects, not just on biodiversity or nature, but on astronomy, about archived weather systems, just about anything you can think of.
There's one called scistarter.org.
Thank you, yes.
It's got thousands of them.
I was trying to remember that, so thank you for that. The Citizen Science Alliance and scistarter.org. I think it's this, but I haven't checked it.
And we've gotten a couple of questions too. So if you are ready for questions, we can.
Always ready for questions.
So when the first question I received was, how old does a tree need to be to draw down significant amounts of carbon? And you did go on to address this a little bit about protecting mature trees and protesting against their destruction.
Well, this is not my field, but this week I've had a wonderful opportunity to educate myself a little bit more about it. And that is because Washington State, as some of you will know, has recently started pushing a couple of new carbon pricing laws through its legislature. And I was asked to testify about one of them by the senator who is pushing it. It's called Washington Strong, the one that she's leading. And it's a green bond system that promises to help people invest in ecosystem health and clean technology and clean energy and so on. But I had a little bit of concern between us, don't quote me on this, that I'm not telling you anything that I haven't told her and her team, but that what was being said in the bill about forests and about forest practices was not supported by science. And one of them was basically that that forests needed to be thinned and cleared out, and that trees that were a certain age could be logged and harvested quite routinely, let's put it that way. It's a more complex thing than this, but not knowing enough about forest carbon flows, I went to two of my colleagues that are world experts in this, and I said, here's this bill, what do you think? And they came back and said, oh my God, this bill, if we don't change this text, it could actually increase carbon emissions rather than decrease them. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is that in looking into this issue a little bit more, I came up with some figures that basically hovered around the idea in forests of the Pacific Northwest, which is not going to be true for other kinds of forests, that trees really should have an 80-year rotation cycle. In other words, they should be allowed to get to at least 80 years old before they can start sequestering carbon. So if you're going to chop down trees, you mustn't chop down trees that are any older than that at all. And certainly should try to keep logging to much younger trees. I saw a question from Tom Weber. 23rd and Cherry Fellowship. No, it wasn't Senator Cantwell or Senator Murray. This is a state senator, Liz Lovelet, who together with the state reps, Deborah Lekanoff and Sharon Shoemake, and a bunch of other collaborators put forward the Washington Strong Bill. There is also another carbon pricing bill called the Climate Commitment Act going through Washington's legislature, and that's a cap and invest act. And it also has provisions for forest health and things like that. And I will share with you that I've developed over the last week a real concern about the careless or casual ways that people use terms like forest health and resilience. We need to make sure that we are being very precise about what we mean and that it is scientifically grounded. Or we could be, as my forest carbon flows colleague says, giving a get out of jail free card to the logging industry to continue to do too much what they want and to therefore potentially increase carbon emissions from Washington state. So be wary when you see nice language that it is not just being used as a platitude. Feel free to interrogate your elected representatives about what they actually know about what it means and how to do it.
So another question, you had mentioned earlier that we need to both know and appreciate the biodiversity loss that's going on, but we need to not be fatalistic about it. And I would appreciate hearing a comment about that. And we also have another follow-up question about the differences, but tree diversity moving into Canada from the States, which I can also come back to. But that question about fatalistic, not how do we hold this information without being frozen by it? You used the word fatalist.
I did, because I've been encountering more and more fatalists and nihilists in the last year, and that really concerns me hugely. I have a very anxious puppy wanting to get up on my lap, so excuse me. I think it's understandable that we are all realizing that a lot of reality is proving to be worse than the worst case scenarios of the IPCC. And I remember that Richard told you that, he certainly told me that, Richard Gammon. And I've observed that from my own work with people who were coordinating lead authors of the IPCC. But it doesn't follow that all is lost. Indeed, we absolutely have to galvanize ourselves right now in the next 5 years to make as much progress at transforming the way we run our economy, the way we use energy in our homes, our communities, our transportation systems as possible. There is a lot going on for good in this country. And those of you who may be professionals in this area, I would love to hear from you about your ideas and your actions. And there is a wonderful group called adaptationprofessionals.org in other words, climate adaptation professionals, which has a wonderful hive of activity on policy and teaching and learning and career development and, basically making change happen on the ground, not just with the typical things that people used to do about climate change, but grounding climate change deeply in the issues of equity and diversity and inclusion. Because if we do not do that now from the start, while we can, we will see our inequalities become even more obscene. And I don't think any of us wants to see that. So that's highly recommended group for any of you who are interested. But the other aspect, I think, Laurie, about fatalism is that it's a personal choice. And for each of us, it's got to be a personal choice. Are we going to be the guy on the Titanic who pushes forward and says, I am with child, when he's the richest guy on the boat and he's stolen someone else's baby? Or are we going to be the people who are trying to keep the Titanic away from the iceberg? And if it does kind of hit the iceberg a little bit and start to sink, are we going to be the people organizing people into lifeboats? And I'm not talking about Mars, but helping manage this process of profound transformation that almost certainly is ahead, in a way that is smooth and just and kind. This calls deeply into what it means to be human. And, maybe I'll be the person playing the violin as everyone gets into the lifeboats. But I'm damned if I'm going to let it be any other way. And I'm certainly going to be in the engine room as much as I can before then, trying to steer, get the engines in reverse and steer the boat away. And that's a personal choice that each of us needs to make. There are a lot of millennials and Generation Z youngsters that I feel are fairly rightly pointing fingers at the baby boomers, knowing that some are very, very motivated in this area and working hard on it, but that an enormous number of people are complacent, unwilling to look in themselves for ways that they might be able to change and contribute to the solutions and not the problem. And just the other day, I had a 20-something guy come in as a fireplace technician into my home, and he asked me idly what I did for a living. And when I told him, he literally said, "Oh, bless you." And he was so sweet. But it became clear to me as I've gone through the past few years that youngsters are angry at our complacency, and we cannot do that to them. They do not deserve that from us.
I want to say thank you. Whew. And I really hate the fact that it's already 3:25.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to speak.
No, that's just the opposite. I think there's so much more. There's some really rich questions here, but before I kind of pull things together here at the end, as a way of saying thank you to Phoebe, I really would like to invite us to take even a minute in silence to absorb so much of what we've heard today. There's more to explore. I'll come back on opportunities, but to offer our silence and our just holding what we've heard today, then I'm going to offer a reading into the silence in about a minute. Don't try to copy it down, because after I read it, we'll put it up on the screen so you can see it. But by way, just on behalf of all of us, we offer this silence, and I'm really wanting to take into all of who we are, the things that we've talked about today, and how much more there is we want to ask you about. So Just a minute. The beauty of the earth is endlessly diverse and unfathomably complex. Billions of species weave their energies together into an interdependent whole, each necessary to the others. Beyond us, the endless explosion of the stars, galaxies, nebula, suns, moons, planets, black holes, and hints of things we have little inkling of dance across the vast expanse of living and vital darkness. Diversity is the fundamental quality of creation and of all beauty. No single note makes a song. No single sound captures the chant of a moving creek. No flower exhausts the possibilities of color and fragrance. We humans like to keep things small and limited, 2 genders, 1 race, 1 religion, 1 nation. But the divine creativity is infinitely expansive, playful, dangerous, and exuberant. So again, and collectively, we offer your thanks, and we want to let everyone know that Phoebe is planning on joining us for our conversations, our follow-up conversations. So there are a number of other questions that have come in about butterflies, more questions on some of the politics, more questions on forest and forest resiliency. We'll continue to collect those. If you have other things as you think about it this week, feel free to send me an email or Susie White, and I will be collecting these pieces. And I would also encourage every one of you after we get off this call, especially if you're going to come back to one of the conversations, to write down some of the things that you heard today as we collect and remember, and then move forward with deepening our understanding both with head and heart. So March 14th, a week from today, will be our first conversation where our flow is a little bit different here. So a week from today, we'll gather again. We'll do more of our breakout group, small group conversations, but also have a chance to further our interactions. And I want to remind you that these are not the same dates exactly that I put up last time we were together. We had a little bit of mix up. So these are the dates: March 14th at 2 p.m. Pacific, or March 18th, a Thursday evening for those of you who are busy on Sunday afternoon. Just by way of a heads up, Sunday, April 11th, Dr. Richard Roy, who's also Susan Oxley's brother, is going to do some more work with us on human impacts that are happening with climate change. And as you can see, we have some other pieces in mind, and I think even from today, stimulating some thoughts about places we really want to go with topics to dive into greater depth. So yeah. Anyone else want to just say thank you or putting them in the chat? And thank you all for your participation and sharing with us your Sunday afternoon. May you be blessed with having heard something that stirs compassion and gives you some thoughts about where you personally feel called to go to continue to meet the challenges of our day with really beautiful and courageous hearts. And thank you, Phoebe, so much. And we will, we're really grateful to you to be willing to come back and continue our explorations with us. It looks like Dean wants to say something. Dean or Susie?
I was just waving. I'm almost speechless from all of the wonderful material and ways of presenting it that we've heard today.
Thank you so much, everybody. It's been a real privilege, and I appreciate your private comments to me and public comments in the chat. It's really lovely. Have a wonderful evening.